Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
The acoustics must be really good here with this microphone. So, first of all, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here this morning. And first of all, I'd like to thank Master Jiru and the Sangha here at Maba for hosting this event. How many of you are here for the very first time for Vesak Day? I want to see hands. Okay, that's good. This event is called Vesak Day, if you hadn't heard that already. And this is put on by the Buddhist Council of St. Louis. And I'd like to speak a little bit about the Buddhist Council at the beginning. There are about 20 Buddhist groups in Greater St. Louis. And once a month we have a meeting, a Buddhist Council meeting, usually at the Thai Temple in Florissant. And of those 20 or so groups, I would say 7 or 8 of us are really the core group that puts on events and participates. And I'd like to mention them. There is Maba, this wonderful place here in Augusta. There is Fogong Shan in Bridgeton. There is the Thai Temple, I've mentioned, in Florissant. There is the Laotian Temple on Cherokee Street. And then there are several Zen temples. There is the Missouri Zen Center in Webster Groves. There is Shinzo Meditation Center, Heartland Sangha, and the Confluence Zen Center. So that's really the heart of the Buddhist Council. And our mission is to be a collaborative group. Now that's a wonderful idea. And really we are a harmonious group, I have to tell you that. But that's rather amazing in the sense that we all trace our origins to the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. And today we are celebrating in Vesak Day the Buddha's birth, death, and enlightenment, okay, in one package. All of the groups in the Buddhist Council trace our origin to the Buddha, who lived about 2,500 years ago. But in 2,500 years, there are different interpretations of the Buddha's teaching. I think you can believe that. If you look at other religions, you see that as well. Christianity, Islam, and so on. And that's true with us as well. That while we all trace our origins to the Buddha, now, in the 21st century, we're not all the same. And that includes those of us in the Buddhist Council. And as one example, in the tradition that I come from, we don't know about Vesak Day. Vesak Day is really, the first time that I celebrated Vesak Day was here in St. Louis. This is a celebration, from my understanding, that comes from the Theravadan tradition. And the Theravadan tradition are those Buddhist groups that we mainly find in Sri Lanka, Burma, or Myanmar, Thailand, and maybe some of the other southeastern countries, Vietnam, perhaps Cambodia, and so on. I'm not really sure about that. In the tradition that I come from, which is Zen, which comes through Japan, we celebrate each of those events of the Buddha's life at 3 different times of the year. And I just thought to tell you that, just to show you one example of the difference. So in my tradition, it's common to celebrate the birth of the Buddha on April the 8th. In Japan, we also call that Flower Festival. And for that reason, we often have many flowers. It is said, as it was said today, the legend is that when the Buddha was born, flowers rained down from heaven. So that's in spring. The death of the Buddha we celebrate or commemorate February 15th. February 15th. And the enlightenment of the Buddha, December the 8th. Now, my teacher always taught his students, including me, not to look at Buddhism through the small lens or keyhole of Zen, which is to say that we shouldn't compare other forms of and schools of Buddhism to Zen. And I always took that to mean that the teaching of Buddhism takes many different forms through the various cultures that I've just mentioned, including China, Korea, and so on. And in Japan, for example, there were traditionally said to be 13 different schools of Buddhism. And those schools of Buddhism resonated with different people in different ways. I mentioned that simply to say that my teacher was encouraging me to take a bigger view, that Zen is not the only way to practice Buddhism, that there are many ways to practice Buddhism, and there's no reason to say one is better than the other. What I'd like to talk about today is a sutra called, in Japanese, Yui Kyogyo. Now, I don't think many of you speak Japanese. The formal name of that sutra is Bushihatsu Nehan Ryakuseku Kyokai Kyo. And this is said in our tradition, in the Mahayana tradition, and I believe in China as well, to be the very last sermon of the Buddha. So on the eve of his death, these were the words that he spoke to his disciples. Okay? Yui Kyogyo, the Sutra of the Buddha's last teaching. And I'm not sure how well known this is here in America. If you're interested in reading a version of that, you can find it on our website, confidencezen.org. You can download it and read it. But what I'm particularly interested in is one part of this sutra. And what's interesting to me, in particular about this sutra, is that the founder of the school that I belong to, the Zen school that I belong to, the Soto Zen school, Dogen Zenji, on the eve of his death, he also quoted directly from the sutra. One part of it, in particular, 8 paragraphs. These 8 paragraphs refer to the 8 aspects of enlightenment, or the 8 awakenings of a great being. Now, another difference, if I might, between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, at least as I understand it, and particularly in Zen, is that in Zen we say that the awakening of the Buddha has been transmitted through the generations, generation to generation, to the present day. And to use one example, I refer to Dogen. And I'm curious, how many of you have never heard of the word Dogen? D-O-G-E-N. And I want to see some hands. Who's never heard of Dogen? I think there are quite a few of you. He's well, you know, I'm biased because he's the founder, right, of the Kyoto sect. But he was a superb and excellent priest. And I want to underline again, I've already said it, but he wrote many difficult texts in his lifetime. He did not live a long life. He was 53 or 54 when he passed away, but he wrote many sublime and difficult texts. But again, the very last, when he knew that he was going to die, the last thing that he wrote was actually just a quote from this sutra, the Sutra of the Buddha's last teaching. And what I'm going to do today pretty much is to read these 8 paragraphs. They're quite easy to understand. And I think when a group like this comes together from many different traditions, we're looking for some common message. This is something that all of us can understand easily. Now, a little bit of what I'm going to read is from Dogen, and I will tell you. And it begins with Dogen. And maybe let's see if I can read this without my glasses. All Buddhas are great beings. The practice of great beings is called the 8 awakenings. Practicing these 8 important aspects leads to nirvana. This is the last teaching of our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, which he gave on the eve of his death and entry into parinirvana. The first important aspect is to have few desires. This means to forsake the 5 desires. So this is Dogen Zenji speaking. And here in the text when I say, the Buddha said, monks, this is a direct quote from the Sutra. Okay? And when he says monks, he's referring to all of you. Monks, nuns, laywomen, laymen. All of you who aspire to practice the Buddha's teaching. He's talking to you. Monks, you must know for certain that a person with many desires suffers much because he seeks fame and profit. Since a person with few desires seeks for neither of these things, he has no anxiety. You must practice if only to have few desires. Furthermore, this virtue can produce many kinds of merit. A person with few desires never seeks other people's approval through flattery, nor is she tempted by the senses. One who practices having few desires is always peaceful and has no fear. In any situation, she finds she has enough and is never lacking anything. Having few desires, she is in nirvana. This is called having few desires. This is number 1. You may know there are different ways of talking about the 5 desires in Buddhism. And all of us, at some times in our lives, and maybe even now, are addicted to one of these desires. One is food and drink. Right? The second one, sleep. Third, sensual contact or lust, sexual lust. Fourth, fame or reputation, which the Buddha is mentioning here. And last, wealth or profit. So the first great awakening of the Buddha is having few desires. And let me say something before I continue here. I'm going to speak for a little less than 45 minutes, and after I'm finished speaking, there will be time for questions, about 30 minutes. All of the monastics, I believe, are invited to answer questions. So one thing that I always talk about, and for those of you who have heard me speak before, you know I speak about this, is that the way we come into the Buddha's teaching is, first of all, we have to hear the teaching. We hear the teaching. We listen to the teaching. There may be some people here today who are listening to the Buddha's teaching for the very first time. You hear the teaching, and then second, it's necessary to think about what you hear. Buddhism is not a matter of simply hearing the teaching once. Oh yeah, just have few desires, and that's it. No, you have to think about, what does that mean, few desires? And I'll have a little bit more to say about that, because desire in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. So we have to think about what we hear. You'll almost inevitably have questions. It's necessary to ask those questions, get good answers, ask more questions if necessary, and finally, Buddhism is about putting it into practice. So this is an encouragement. I'm encouraging you to jot down those questions or keep track of those questions, and you'll have time after I finish speaking to ask them. Okay, back to the talk, back to the Buddha. His first important aspect is to have few desires. The second is satisfaction or contentment. This means knowing how much is enough. The Buddha said, monks, if you want to be free from all suffering, and that's what we all want, you must know contentment. The Dharma of contentment is the realm of riches. comfort, peace, and tranquility. A contented person is happy, even if he sleeps on the ground, while a discontented person is unsatisfied, even with a heavenly palace. A discontented person is poor, even though he has much money, while a contented person is rich, even though she has very little. A contented person pities a dissatisfied person, for the latter is enslaved to those 5 desires. This is called knowing how much is enough, or contentment. The third is to enjoy tranquility. This means to lead a quiet life, separated from all worldly disturbances. The Buddha said, monks, if you want the peace and comfort found in the tranquility of non-doing, you must keep away from disturbances and live in a quiet place. A person who lives in a quiet place is respected by both King Sakrenda and by celestial beings. Therefore, abandon attachment to yourself and to other people, live a solitary life, and contemplate the way to eliminate suffering. If a person wishes for the company of many people, he will suffer from it, just as if many birds were to perch on a branch, that branch would wither and break. People drown in the sufferings brought about by the bondage of worldly involvement, just as an old elephant drowns in the mud because he cannot get out by himself. This is called living in solitude, or living in quiet. So that's number 3. The fourth is diligence. This means to do good wholeheartedly and continuously. The Buddha said, monks, if you make diligent effort, nothing will be difficult for you. Therefore, you must practice diligently, just as water flowing continuously can eventually wear away rock. But if your practice is lax, it is like trying to start a fire by rubbing 2 sticks together. If you stop before the wood gets hot, you cannot start a fire. This is called diligent endeavor. That's number 4. The 5th is continual awareness. This is also called not to lose mindfulness. The Buddha said, monks, when you seek for a good teacher and good advice, nothing is more important than continual awareness of the true Dharma. With this awareness, the thief-like multitudes of the deluding passions cannot break in. Therefore, you must always bear this in mind, for if you lose it, all sorts of merits and virtues will be lost. If this awareness is strong and firm, just as an armored warrior, you will not fear the enemy. This is called continual awareness of the true Dharma. Number 6 is the practice of Samadhi. Samadhi means to reside in the truth, in an undisturbed, settled state of mind. The Buddha said, monks, when a person's mind is unified, she is in Samadhi. When the mind is in Samadhi, the nature of the world of birth and death is understood. Therefore, you must practice diligently and cultivate all kinds of Samadhi. When you attain Samadhi, your mind will not be scattered. Just as those who value water maintain it carefully with a dike. This is also true of practice. To maintain the water of wisdom, cultivate Samadhi well to prevent it from leaking out This is called Samadhi. And Samadhi is another word for, some people would say, meditation. In our school, we call this Zazen. In a greater way, it means simply to be one with any activity you do. And my teacher was fond of saying that if you know you're in Samadhi, you're not in Samadhi. So that also means forgetting that you're in Samadhi. The seventh aspect of enlightenment is to practice wisdom. This is to listen, think, practice, and attain realization, what I was earlier mentioning. Listening to the teaching, thinking about the teaching, putting it into practice, and realizing it for yourself. The Buddha said, monks, when you have wisdom, you are without greed. You see, he's returning to that first statement. They have few desires. You must always reflect on yourself and never lose this wisdom. In so doing, you can attain liberation in the Dharma. Those who do not are neither people of the way nor lay people. A person with true wisdom is like a